Good evening, everybody. My name is Ware Harmon, and I'm the Executive Director of Town Hall Seattle. On behalf of our staff, it's a pleasure to welcome you to tonight's virtual presentation of Charles Wolfe in conversation with Steve Scher as part of our Civic series. As we get underway, I want to acknowledge that our institution stands on the unceded traditional territory of the Coast Salish people, and particularly the Duwamish. We thank them for our continuing use of the natural resources of their ancestral homeland. We thank you all for joining us here on our streaming platform. It's a new one, I should say, myths.org. Like everything at Town Hall, it is decidedly a work in progress, so please don't hesitate to share your thoughts at the address that you'll see in the chat below the video pane. Tonight's conversation will run about an hour, including Q&A. Questions will be selected from those in the chat field below the video, so please submit yours at any time. You can also text questions to 206-504-2857. That's also noted in the chat. Can't guarantee we'll get to every question, but we'll try to get to as many as possible. For those who'd like to view the program with closed captions, click the CC button in the bottom right corner of the video player. Town Hall's adding new programs every day, at least through the end of June. Thereafter, we'll take a little bit of a hiatus. Upcoming programs, though, include housing expert Dana Borland in conversation with Grift's Clayton Aldern, discussing how the climate crisis intersects with the housing crisis. The 100th episode of our in-house podcast, In the Moment, it's released this Monday with Town Hall staff as guests, recalling the last year's ups and downs. That'll be hosted by our very own Steve Scher, or co-hosted, I should say, by our very own Steve Scher. Pulitzer Prize winner, Professor Annette Gordon-Reed, discussing her new book on Juneteenth, which is called On Juneteenth. Also, 2 live in-person events in our Great Hall. That's like with actual people in our actual pews. The first will be a very cool installation under the dome in the Great Hall, the culmination of a residency with Timothy White Eagle. And the second will feature the extraordinary range and delicate phrasing of Janae Kendrick, a terrific local jazz singer, in an evening co-produced with our friends at Earshot Jazz. Tickets are available for both of those online, and you can also view that last program online if you're not quite ready to join us in the building. You can check out more of what's upcoming by visiting townhallseattle.org. Our work is made possible through your support and the support of our sponsors. Our civics programs are supported by the Real Networks Foundation, the True Brown Foundation, KUOW, the Norcliffe Foundation, and the Wyncote Foundation Northwest. Finally, though, Town Hall is at heart a member-supported organization, and I want to thank all of our members watching this evening. Okay, here's the real finally. You'll definitely want to dive in deeper into tonight's conversation, and the best way to do that is to purchase a copy of the book. You can use the link in the chat to purchase directly through the publisher this evening. Pay attention, there's a promo code there listed as well. And if you use that promo code, then you can avoid purchasing from, some other big online retailer. No promo codes there. Use the link that we've got for you in the chat tonight. All right, and with that, Charles R. Wolfe is a London-based urbanism consultant. He's also an author, a longtime environmental and land use author. And he's been an associate professor, also a longtime associate professor in the College of the Built Environment at the University of Washington. His books include Seeing the Better City, How to Explore, Observe, and Improve Urban Space from 2016, and 2013's Urbanism Without Effort, Reconnecting with First Principles of the City. Steve Scher is a podcaster, broadcaster, writer, interviewer, and teacher. He's the former host of KUOW's Weekday, and he's taught interviewing at the University of Washington since 2009. He's also, as I mentioned, the senior correspondent of Town Hall's in-house podcast, In the Moment, as well as hosting his own podcast series, At Length with Steve Scher. Wolfe's new book, Sustaining a City's Culture and Character, Principles and Best Practices, is the subject of their discussion tonight. Please join me in welcoming Steve Scher and Charles R. Wolfe.
Thanks, Weir. Appreciate it, Weir. It's good to see you again, as always. Chuck, it's good to be talking with you again. We have talked a lot because you are, of course, among other things, a Seattleite. Even though you live in London now, I'm still calling you a Seattleite. Is that all right?
That's fine. I'm actually in Seattle right now. I didn't want to get up at 3 in the morning, so I flew here.
All right, so I said I was going to start on something else, but I want to start with this. A few years ago, we did a walk around podcast of the Bell Streets in Seattle, looking at how they worked, where they worked, whether they worked. One of the things I remember was we were watching people violate the traffic signs that said "Do not enter" in every block. But you said you looked at them today, but you were downtown today, and I think the phrase you used was downtown. You were very charming. Downtown is an ambiguous place, as are all downtowns right now, or is it just Seattle that's an ambiguous downtown right now?
I said downtown is an ambiguous place, as are all downtowns right now. So
because of COVID?
Yeah, I'm not the first to say. Many urbanists, much more noted than I, have said that the pandemic is an accelerator of many things that were happening anyway.
Maybe. Do we think that's true? Do you think that's true?
Yeah, well, I think in many cases it's true. And I will say, as to issues of, in the UK, the high street, the main street, brick and mortar retail versus online retail, the war on cars, the place of bicycles, al fresco dining outside, places like Bell Street where the pedestrians take back. I mean, that was all happening anyway. And so the question is, how much of this, as usual, Steve, you've asked a question that I absolutely agree with, how much of this is really due to the pandemic? And hey, we none of us really know, do we?
But
these are, yeah, go ahead.
But the one thing that's a little different is that downtowns are also, especially this downtown, are also now have been, I'm going to use the phrase occupied because it is political as well as necessary, it seems. Downtown has been occupied by people in tents who don't have homes.
That's right.
And the city, this city anyway, has determined that the sidewalks are to be shared,
right,
as home space for people. And let's leave out all the things that means, because we can't tackle it all. But really what that tells us is that seems to me the most major change in downtowns. And I wonder if that's going to go back to pushing and shunting folks further away.
Yeah, I mean, so Seattle's not the only city. Portland and others, have welcomed the concept that public space can be used for the less fortunate. And these questions are going on around the world. Some countries take better care of people than others. And so you don't see what you've just described here everywhere. And if you see it, say in Paris, you have a very different form of occupancy with nice cardboard boxes that are nicely folded during the day, and they tend to be next to heat vents and things like that. I don't want to jump into the book yet, but it's very contextual. I would argue that these issues are often transcendent, based on the human condition and the relationship with urban places. But given the local socio-political structure or other things, they're going to show themselves in different ways. So if your question is, are we going to go back to moving people off of sidewalks? I don't, it's a valid question, right?
I just wonder if downtowns are going to be perceived differently in the future because of how they've been used over the past year and a half.
Very possibly. That's a broad question, and it's going to depend where and exactly what you're talking about, I think. But it's a very viable question, because just as the workplaces are changing and have forever changed for a while anyway, there's other patterns that a lot of people are hoping do remain, having to do with more outdoor dining, more use of public space by the public rather than automobiles, and so on and so forth. I think it's a wait and see. We don't know the answer to that, and I wouldn't pretend to be an expert on Seattle anymore, because I've been gone for almost 4 years. But I know the trends.
It almost feels like those kinds of questions. How we're going to use public space, whether al fresco dining will be in conflict with people using sidewalks, seem to be first world concerns of a pre-COVID time. And it seems what's been revealed about cities is how fragile they are, and how easy it is for us, the inhabitants of those cities, to feel them slipping away. Is that a valid statement from your perspective? I don't want to put you as the be all and end all of things, but
I'm absolutely not. It's like, why are you asking me this? No, seriously, I think that I go back to what I started with. There are socio-political climatic change. It was happening anyway, but the magic mixture of the pandemic and these pre-existing trends have bared the realities, I think, a lot more blatantly than would have happened otherwise. And in some,
well, in some ways, people have argued about gentrification, for example, for years, and a lot of people have taken that as an esoteric argument. And why are you talking about this? This is what happens in cities. But what we see is what gentrification is, as we have seen revealed all around us, is deliberate political and economic decisions that force certain people out so other people can come in.
Right. And I think I think one thing that I have learned since you and I last talked about these issues on the air anyway, is that there are so many pieces of this puzzle, so many different disciplines, and you know, what is on first base, the politics or
Who
the
is on
human,
first base? Chuck?
yeah, what, or who, or, you know, whatever. I mean, it's
What's
gonna,
on second? Sorry, you started it though.
Anyway.
Okay, let me ask you this in this way. You were on a stage with some folks in Portugal.
Yeah.
Describe the scene and describe what happened, because it seems to me that that sort of is the nub of what you're thinking about when you think about how to look at cities and how we need to think about cities.
Yeah, well, thanks for asking me, because that's a real fire starter, as you know, for me. And I'll try and be efficient in my answer. In late 2017, based on my old book, I was already mostly not a lawyer anymore, but I didn't know it at the time. And I was doing what I thought, well, I already knew that we were moving to the UK, and I already knew I was going to have a part-time job in Sweden for the following 2 years. But I was down in Portugal at the invitation of a very nice guy named Victor Pereira, and we were on tour with Seeing the Better City. And we went to some of the interior towns in Portugal, not Porto, not Lisbon, but, you know, towns in the hills and so on and so forth. And in one of them, I was on stage talking about the smart city with some tech guys, cell phone company types who were, and also, you know, vendors of smart city technology, monitoring devices and so on and so forth. I was the guy who was talking the qualitative side of city life and talking about how to see the city and understand the city in those days in a much more two-dimensional way. That's what that book was about. And there was a guy who was on the city staff, and he basically said, "Who the hell are you guys?" And it was guys, it's three guys, to tell us contextually what we should do here in Braganza. Because, you know, said to the technology guys, "You're talking about monitoring, you know, air quality monitoring, and we don't even have cell phone service where I live in the village outside of town. You know, what are you talking about? And you," and he looked right at me, "and you come from America, and you think you can tell us that things that work in the United States will work here." You know, in so many words, it was a Greta Thunberg, "How dare you," you know? And I grabbed the microphone, and viscerally, and I'm sitting there so impressed by the context of the place, which is, you know, which don't have time to go into, but let's just say it was old. It was everything that was emblematic of a long history and Portuguese empire and colonizing the world and all sorts of, you know, very important things. And I said, "You know what? You are absolutely right. You are absolutely right. And please don't think of me as telling you what to do, because I very much honor what I'm seeing here. I'm trying to help people understand the context of where they are." And I said to the technology guys, I said, "You guys are acting like, you know, American salesmen, you know, he's right, you know." And so right after that, I was motivated. I went back to Sweden and I wrote an article called "Forget Smart, We Need Context Cities." And that became the basis for the project that led to this book.
And when you're talking about context, you're talking about, and this is a quote from the book, inspiration, historical context, and interdisciplinary cultural expression in framing the sustainable urban environments. Unpack that for me.
That, first of all, we live in a time of tools that oftentimes consultants, mission-based urbanists, and others will have a range of interventions that will, in many cases, improve a place. They will do some of the things we're talking about. They'll activate public spaces. They'll assist populations in need. They will address climate change issues. But what I'm talking about in that gobbledygook of words is that it really matters that we understand the essence of a place before we go forth with prescriptions. And the essence of a place is made up of many, many things, not just the architecture. It's the underlying natural environment. It's the stories of the place that may go back hundreds and thousands of years. It's the social realities. It's the injustices of the past as they're expressed. You get the idea. It's so many things. And my argument is, in order to sustain what we have, we need to understand what we have. And the book is a call to an immersion to understand the context of a particular environment at different scales before we go forth. Now, it's an ideal concept. It's an ideal action-forcing book. Sometimes we don't have time to do that, but it's a call to really take a hard look at the totality of a place if possible. And it's very consistent with, I think, an Indigenous people's way of understanding an environment as well.
Well, I think I've said it every time I've done one of these. I think it's important that the trend here in Seattle and at Town Hall is to start meetings by acknowledging whose land this was, because that puts it in the context and everything else in context as we move forward.
Right, and you may know Weir's introduction is, it's a parallel to what's been going on in Australia for many years. And oftentimes a representative, and that happens here as well, a representative of the Indigenous people who once lived and nurtured the place are asked to give that introduction. And if they don't show up, then Weir does it. That's
yeah.
Yeah.
So. I find myself telling stories about my neighborhood all the time to people who may or may not really care. But I realize that I do it because it helps me understand how I ended up in this house that was built in 1914 in this neighborhood. And I always tell the story about the glacial erratic that's up the street from me. It's this giant rock that somehow got preserved when they built the subdivision. And I tell the story about this boarding house that is down on 26 that is over 100 years old, that exists because it was giving a place to live for the men who came to chop down all the trees and supply the timber to the second Yesler mill that's in a little bay off of the Center for Urban Horticulture in Seattle. So
right.
It's that's the kind of context you're talking about, I think. When you took a walk in your now home, and you walked in your town of Newbury, England, and you took
Yes.
a walk to Bristol, right?
60 miles. Yeah, it was a 7-day walk, but
7-day walk. Well,
yeah.
what were you like? What was the context of the landscape you were moving to?
Well, one amazing thing about living abroad is that, at least I'm like you, we've talked about this, you and I have talked about this for years. I love to immerse as well and really understand a place. And so for those of you in the audience who know England at all, you know that Newbury is about 45 miles west of London, located on it's actually a place where two rivers come together, but it's been channelized, there's a somewhat restored canal, the Kennet and Avon Canal, and it goes all the way to Bristol. It goes through Bath and turns more into the Avon River, but you can walk it. And we did it, and it was a remarkable refresher on English history. And if any of you have watched, say, The Last Kingdom, Bernard Cornwell's books that were turned into a here in the US. It was run on I think on PBS, but in any event, maybe Netflix, whatever. It's the story of the last English king, Alfred, the first English king. In a sense, he united, the countries, the Saxons, I'm sorry, against the Danes. And so all of this legendary stuff was before our eyes. But it wasn't just that. It's the diversity of place, the diversity of different size of towns, the diversity of forms of transport, the diversity of the landscape. When one, and a lot of people write about this, when one walks and takes these this is also called deep listening or learning, you sort of absorb the essences of these places as you travel through them. And, it may be the story of John Rennie, who engineered the canal and the amazing 29 locks at Devizes. Well, these are guys who then came to the United States and did the canals in the East. There's so much unpacked. And, there was this, you heard me talk about this before, Steve, but, in 879, Alfred the Great met his older brother at a tump, which is a hill, a very distinct looking hill, to go north to fight the Danes. And you look and it's like 879, huh? Well, that's a little while ago, but it's still here. And you walk by where, one of Henry VIII's wives, Jane Seymour, is from, Wolfe Hall and the famous book and so on. And then you end up, you go through Bath and all the Georgian architecture, and you end up in Bristol, which is a fascinating city. It's not, when I come home, I say, please don't think of me as an old white guy writing a book about historic preservation. That's, there's a lot of history in this, but it's the embedded reality of these places, and not just fanciful history or ideal tourist-based characterizations. It's also what they are now. And it's also what you see with the populations there today, how they got there, what today's reality might be, which may be entirely different than, of course it's entirely different than this classical English history. And it should be. And, sometimes, it can, the correct reality and the correct path going forward is entirely based on the people who are there today. So I don't want to get too romantic about this. What I want to espouse is the importance of understanding as much as one can about a given place in as many ways as possible.
All right, you have some pictures that you're going to share from the book. And while you're pulling that up, and we'll go to the first picture, here's the general question I want you to consider. How does that embedded history, how does that understanding of context affect the way I should think about whether a Starbucks should move in to an old brick building in an old high street neighborhood of an old town in England?
Well, I happen to have an answer for that, Steve. Thank you. No, seriously, the answer can be, the answer is so different depending on the place. And sometimes it has to do with whether Starbucks, and this is the way Starbucks endeared itself to several European countries and cities. And that is, sometimes they'll operate within the ambit. They'll do exactly what I'm arguing for. They will operate within the ambit of the physical environment that they will occupy, and they'll bring it back. And I don't want to jump ahead here, but Apple Foster and Partners, the English architecture urban design firm, is touting its new Apple store on Via del Corso in Rome, which is exactly that, and entirely different than the Apple store experiences that we hopefully will have time to talk about at the end of the day. So part of it is how much they listen and learn about where they're walking into, and how much they are willing to bend to what is a correct understanding of what the local area demands and what the current uses are and who lives there. So much of this book is about understanding the intersection, the blend of global forces and existing local conditions. And so the photo I have here is kind of a mock-up. This is a crude page of what is now the book when I was just starting out, and you see the arrows around these photos. This is the downtown of Richmond upon Thames, a borough of London. And you can see in the text, I start explaining this learn method with, essentially is a driver and an improvement upon my earlier method of how to get to the nub of a place. Learn is look, engage, assess, review, and negotiate. And negotiate is all about the interaction with the people who live there. So anyway, this is an answer to your question. This is a driver of the analysis that one must go through to answer the question about whether that Starbucks should locate there.
Well, what am I looking at?
You're looking at a building that I'm not aware. I do not remember the original use of this building, but you're looking at essentially the equivalent of a Starbucks, a franchise coffee and juice establishment. And what I am trying to explain is all the things that you can see in this photograph, from the sky to beneath the ground. And it's an invitation to think critically and immerse and take apart what you're looking at in accord with the words that are written. The public works beneath, the Wi-Fi kiosk off to the right, the what's left of nature, the flowers stall to the left, so on and so forth.
There are plenty of people who would look at that and pull their hair out, though, right? How do you talk to those folks about changing uses of old buildings in a new world?
Well, I think we have to say, and this is the question, back to your pandemic question, the accelerated question about how do we reuse these spaces if they're structurally sound and it's economical to do so, which is always a big if, especially here in the United States. I think you explain that it's critically important, even with some developers who want profit, even some citizens who don't want change. It's important to find the mechanisms to listen and come up with the optimal understanding of the blend and the best compromise. Now, in Weir's introduction, he said environmental and land use author. And as you know, I was an environmental and land use lawyer for 34 years, and some of the seemingly esoteric concepts that I introduce here are directly from my learning in the trenches and trying to figure out ways to find the best meeting points between top down and bottom up.
We need to understand, again, it's about context. We need to see all the different ways that humans build places and not see them as stuck in any one era. But it seems like the fundamental argument you're making is that the people who live there must be the ones to be the final arbiters of their space. But there's plenty of people who would say, but they don't own the buildings. They're just they're transitory too. 100 years ago, a different group lived there, and 100 years from now, another group will live there.
That's right. But let's go to some of the practical issues that show up in a place like this. If there's a bank in this down the street, this issue does come up. If there was a bank there and the bank is no longer there because there's no need for in-person banking anymore, why would you put in another bank? Why would you put in just a cash machine? Why wouldn't you figure out some other potential use that makes sense based on the current population?
The use that serves the people that are there.
Exactly. And sometimes the question about, and I write about this, the question about brick and mortar stores versus online. Why can't you do both? Why can't you have a storefront, but you have the online operation in the back? I mean, these are the discussions that are going on today, accelerated by the pandemic. And I have all sorts of examples of what some may say. I don't know if we have time to get to it, so I'll slip it in here. The Bobtail Fruit in London, which is essentially an online order your fruit, veg for the office, or during the pandemic, the home. Bobtail Fruit started out as a fruit stall in the old Covent Garden. It went from brick and mortar or whatnot to totally online with the same customer service and many of the same customers. Now, the American tourist, with all due respect, who loves the borough market in Southwark, may think it's just a real shame that Bobtail Fruit doesn't have a place at this subsidized market that tourists like. Well, you know what? Is it really that bad that they operate out of a warehouse in a rail arch near Waterloo Station, and they still have a great product, and they still do what they always did, but they deliver? I mean, these are the ways things need to change to create successful places. It's not just about even public space. It's about revisioning our cities based on today's realities and not throwing out all of the old, but blending it into something new and exciting.
Chuck, when you said that, I thought about the arguments people made in 1968 about why the market, Pike Place Market, could be torn down, because we can get our fruits at grocery stores. And even today, we can have our fruits delivered. Why do I have to go to a day staller at this quaint market that is subsidized by, taxpayers?
Well, I mean, there's room for that, but I'd say that there's also, it's in all cases. I mean, obviously there need to be those stalls, and there's other examples in the book about a starter markets that make that possible, where renting the stall is not very expensive right now. But what I'm trying to say is, it's not, and you've already said this, Steve, it's not a static reality. Things are changing in a way that we can adapt. And there's nothing magic about this. There's nothing new. I've had the fantastic opportunity the last 3 or 4 years to really think about this and see it underway in different places. Admittedly, not enough in the global South, not enough in Asia, but these trends are pretty amazing. And different trends are going to be applicable to different places. But I have my favorite example in the book is the handyman, Plamen the handyman from Bulgaria, who said to me, places are really the same. It's just in some places one thing's better than the other. It's like, that's right.
Why? Why is that your favorite example?
Oh, because he was such a salt of the earth guy.
Yeah, but why is the concept your favorite example? I mean, yeah, some places do some things better than others. Does that mean we want to emulate the places?
No, absolutely not. No, it's that we have a matrix of human needs, and that I think, to answer your question, it's a very good question. And the way he resonated to me is, we're bridging cultural gaps. We're, a guy from Bulgaria who immigrated to London, and a guy from the United States who essentially immigrated to London, and we're finding common ground based on human universals, and we can agree on some very fundamental things, and maybe we can work together to input our knowledge about what we do better and what someone else does better, and we can work together to create a more magical blend. And so I guess, my answer is, it's exciting to me because it's all about human potential and finding commonality with people that, I didn't necessarily, I would have something in common with. And
yeah. Well, let's look at this next picture, because this goes right to it. And the tool you're talking about is the one you've thought about. Look really look at a place, engage in that place and all the different ways we can engage in it, assess what's going on, review it, negotiate it. I want to come back to assess. What's going on here and how do I assess what this is?
Well, there's a bunch of umbrellas. Well, I mean, without knowing the backstory, you might not be able to figure it out. But here's the quizzical question. I'm on the left. I'm in a Italian hill town, not too far from the French border, on a artisanal street, you know, commercial street. This hill town is really interesting without those umbrellas, for all of the reasons that hill towns are fascinating. On the right, I'm in an epic Walter Benjamin type gallery in Paris. There's those umbrellas. And you can see those umbrellas, you could see at the time I took these, before the pandemic, you'd see these umbrellas in Terminal 5 and Heathrow. You could see them in Vienna. You could see them. I had a friend tell me she saw them on a beach, on a path to a beach in Zanzibar in Tanzania. What's going on? And in reality, speaking of Portugal, these derive from something that was called the Umbrella Sky Project in Aveiro, Portugal in 2011. And because of social media and the internet, these photos got flashed around of the suspended umbrellas in the air, and people really, for whatever reason, liked them. And they started installing them as public art, if you will, placemaking, if you will, around the world. And I guess the question is, do you really need them in an Italian hill town? And I guess the argument is, well, it's drawing people to the commercial street. Do you need them in a gallery in Paris? Well, it's a nice touch. The color adds some spontaneity. What's going on? I mean, we need umbrellas for the rain. It's a universal. It goes back to Plowman the handyman, and some things better than others. We all need shelter from rain. A very accomplished cultural affairs consultant in London reminded me they're also very affordable. So you can spice up a place with them. But I guess the question for me, and I use this in the book to drive the question, hey man, these are totally out of context, arguably, right? They have nothing to do with their setting, and they have really very little to do with even the original popularization of the concept in Portugal. Does that mean we should be contemptuous or cynical about them? Maybe not, because they work and people like them.
Because they feel good, that's enough. We enjoy them.
Maybe it is. And I don't know the answer to this, but I find it a very curious one. And I would put these, during the period of research of the book, I put these up on my Facebook account, and it was like, oh no, not the umbrellas again. But everyone would volunteer examples of where they'd seen them as well. And so I kind of had a crowdsourced, piece of research going about what the heck. And I guess that's all right. But it may be something that, I guess it's also my way of saying, even though I'm all high-handed about learn, maybe sometimes out of context is okay because it's improving the place.
Well, you've talked about context, the keys of context: familiarity, congruity, integrity. There's familiarity here.
Right.
I don't know if there's integrity, but I guess
that's it. No, you're exact. Yeah. No, thank you for reading the book, because that's the question that is being answered. The whole idea, when you get to the pedagogical side of the book, there's this framework, this action forcing framework called Learn, which we've talked about. And then you run it through these context keys, which you've just kindly recited. Familiarity, congruity, and integrity. Is there integrity? No. Is there congruity? Maybe, depending on how you look at congruity. But my goal is to encourage the discussion. And a lot of people don't like my writing because I won't tell them the right answer, because maybe there isn't a right answer, right?
Again, you're going back to what a local group of people will decide about their space.
Right.
In the best of all possible worlds.
Right, exactly.
What's the next picture?
The next picture is oh, that looks like a familiar place.
Right. Here's Seattle.
Here's Seattle, and this is the Seattle, of my youth and the Seattle of the last 10 years, 5 years. I was very active before I left in some of the issues of the day, about single family zoning versus not, about boxy occupations, if you will, of narrow lot housing. And then, a lot of people who didn't like them, which is the land use sign down on the left, perhaps. But here's Seattle, and I wrote a piece for Crosscut, which is adapted in the book as I was leaving town, about some of the magical aspects of it, having to do with the view of Mount Rainier and the water, things that some very well-known authors have written about Seattle. But, here again, we have, in the central area, going up to Madrona, across from, this is about, 24th and Union. And the question is, Martin Luther King. And the question is, okay, a lot of people don't like this. A lot of people don't like these changes, but maybe they're necessary. And it's the aesthetics that people don't like oftentimes, and it's the density that people argue about. But it may be the appropriate contextual solution for these times to help resolve affordability issues and or other issues of the day. But I think this is designed to bring these issues into stark contrast, and this is sort of the transition between my second book and the current book, because this would have been in the second book saying, oh, let's take a look at this photo and how do we understand what's going on here? Well, now I'm taking it much farther and saying, let's look at this holistically. And even though you might not like what it looks like, here's why you don't like what it looks like. But you know what? Maybe it's a necessity. Maybe, perhaps there could have been a better approach to the architecture. Maybe not. But you don't need to tell me that a lot of people don't like this. But then there's the argument that it may be the totally appropriate solution for these times.
But how do we have a say in that? That's really what people are most critical of. How do we have a say in this? How do we have a say in where people who live on the sidewalks downtown, how they get a place to live? They're surrounded by empty office buildings, and yet they live on a street. How do we have a say, we as citizens, we as people, understanding that this is about context, not about architecture?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think part of it is the political process, and there's a mayor's, I follow things enough here to know there's a mayor's election where these issues are being debated. Some candidates in particular speaking to finishing the zoning reform that will allow these types of things to happen, and perhaps have local inputs that are a little more meaningful than the current contentious system. It's not an easy, I don't have the magic bullet, okay? I spent a lot of time struggling with this, advocating for one side or another. But what I do know is that, and what I think I'm trying to do is get the issues on the table and acknowledge the reality that you've already restated, that these things need to be resolved through some co-created process that redesigns the role and the influence of the people who live in a given place. And you can scale that place from the neighborhood up to the city as a whole or to the region. There's lots of arguments legally about what's appropriate for the people to decide. But the reality is that, you keep saying it, Steve, that, we need to find a way to empower people to participate and have a voice in the process. And that's not just an American thing. That's going on in all democracies right now.
All right, so here's a few questions and it starts off right with this concept that you're talking about, like who gets to be part of that process. And the Seattle Times the other day had an editorial that said it's time to recognize the Duwamish tribe. It's time to acknowledge who lived here and that they have been deprived of their rights to their land, and without a treaty they have been left, landless,
Right.
rightless. So here's a question. Here's a question about that, like with that notion in mind. Do you see a way to actually turn urban land back over to indigenous groups for their use, to actually have pockets, public spaces that decenter whiteness? Could this be done in a contextual and relatively uncontroversial way? And do you think it'd be worth doing?
Well, okay, I don't know that it can be done. I think it can be done in a contextual way. I don't know if it can be done in a controversial way. You'll notice, you probably noticed in the book, I talk about a somewhat unique project in Vancouver where, tribal land is being revisioned and redesigned by a band. I mean, essentially an indigenous people as developer in partnership with others. It can be done. I mean, go to Australia for the examples of the kinds of things you're talking about.
Give me one. What did they do? What did they do? Give us one.
Well, I mean, it first of all, it involves bringing the affected people into the process, whatever that may be, and it gets back to this idea of community-based architecture or co-design or co-creation. And I think to some degree this has happened in the central area in Seattle at when I was interviewed back in by the Daily Journal, not Daily Journal, but the Puget Sound Business Journal back in with the other book in 2016. What has happened at 24th and Union in terms of the Africa Town development. And this is happening in Paris. It's happening around the world. It's these partnerships that are, the old models of authority are compromised to give a more meaningful voice to stakeholders. And I do think it's possible with the appropriate leadership to bring, if you're talking about the literal example of indigenous land, back to the use of descendants and so on and so forth. Now, I want to say something that's very important here that I've realized through talking about this book, and that is, I think one thing that happened to me along the way as a lawyer, I like to talk a lot about my writing and how I was influenced by my dad, who was a planning professor. But one thing that turned the tide for me was when I was involved for Sound Transit and for Vulcan, for the Paul Allen, on the Seahawks practice facility in Renton, and then the Link Light Rail project as well, in the tribal consultations that are mandated by federal law. And I watched tribal elders go to places and listen and sense the significance thereof. And I now understand that by participating in those processes and being, yeah, sure, I was a lawyer on site, but it was a very affable and fascinating process, an interactive process. I realized that, hey, there's something, there's a reason we have these consultations, and how they should not be just box check exercises. So it can be done. It can be done.
It has to be meaningful.
Right.
Will you do me a favor? Just because we're going to run out of time soon, and I know I blathered a little bit. Go two pictures up. Go to the one that looks at our personal stories.
Sure.
Even though that's a very cool picture.
Yeah.
Why did you include this?
Well, I guess part of place memory, and there's these subdisciplines of psychology and the various architectures and so on and so forth and the cultural geography that have gained a lot of foothold amid all that we're talking about. Psychogeography, the idea of place attachment and place memory. And, a shout out to landscape architects here in Seattle, like Shannon Nickel at GGN, who essentially looks for the ghosts in the landscape, just like you do, Steve, with regard to the glacial feature.
Yeah, vanishing Seattle.
Yeah, well, and Shannon will tell you, and the David Williams books and all that kind of stuff. Shannon will tell you, and I've asked her this because I've been involved in panels with her lately, virtual panels. I say, so Shannon, you do this for a client. Do you guys necessarily create design features based on what you learn about the long-term stratigraphy of the land? And the answer is no. It's going through the exercise that's very important. But anyway, the personal story and the understanding that people have about a given locus can make a big difference. Now, this is an important story to me, and I have others in the book about, friends who migrated from the old Czechoslovakia and so on and so forth. But this is a very personal story. This is not in England, it's in Newburyport, Massachusetts. This is where my mom was born, upstairs. This was my grandparents' store through the 20s and 30s and 40s and into the 50s and even the early 60s, maybe. I don't remember. I hardly remember it as a kid, but my brother was there during World War II and my dad was away and so on and so forth. Already you're getting the memory is keyed by the place. Well, I know we're getting short on time, but a few years ago, one of my cousins sent me a news article in the Newburyport paper, and it said, Mr. India site sold, condos planned. And those condos are probably built right by now. I know they had to get a zoning variance and it was delayed. But the point was, this was already a closed Mr. India restaurant. And my cousin, David, wrote, hey, nobody mentioned the Fellman family in Fellman's Corner. Huh. And when I went back to this place in 2013 or 14, because I actually went up to Manchester, New Hampshire to talk about my first book, to a housing conference. I went down to the family, where my family is from in the United States. Man, I touched the doorknob and I thought about, that you can see it down there. I thought about what this meant. I thought about, wow, think of how many times my relatives touch this doorknob and, so, we can all get very emotional about these things, and we all have these memories of places, and that matters. And that both not only explains why people get so emotional about the change around them, but it also perhaps creates stories that should be somehow honored in future development and future change. And yeah, you mentioned Vanishing Seattle and the Instagram account that's been built around that, and a lot of other cities. Those are often premised, or the Ghosts of Lost Seattle that Jamie Garbachick did here some years ago that I actually had a chapter in. That's really important stuff, and it's part of this mix of learn. So that's what this photo's about.
But those landscape architects you talked about, they said they go through the exercise, but it doesn't necessarily inform their design.
It might.
How should it inform their design?
Well, sometimes sometimes they may come up with nothing that's very interesting or important, but sometimes it may be the basis for reclaiming a lost river. It may be the basis for re-accentuating a natural feature that once was, that helps define the site and helps define, what goes on. And so I don't know what percentage of times they don't, if I said to them, or any other professional who does this kind of forensic work, which I talk about in the book in terms of San Francisco and lost rivers of London and all these types of, it's like, well, how much does it really inform a future design? Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. But the exercise, I think, is an important step because it might unveil something very, very important.
And it lays down a history that is as important as anything else is part of it.
Right, but it's also, some people ask, well, you talk about context. What if the place has no context? What if it has no history? What if this is a new whether this is a green development? Well, I have some urban design friends, and one of the leading academics in urban design in the United Kingdom has a new version of his epic textbook. And he says that one thing has changed, and that is now he views urban design as including the natural landscape on a virgin site.
I would hope so.
Yeah, well, but that's new to some people. That's new to some people. And it's nonetheless critically important. So let's see.
Here's a question, and then go back to the, where were you going, to this one?
Well, yeah, I don't know how much time we have, but I'll go.
Go back to that one, because and then I want to read you a question though, and then it kind of relates to this in a way. Maybe not.
Okay.
Chuck, how do you negotiate between historic preservation laws that leave buildings unrestored and current age economics business that may have resources to restore those crumbling buildings? Not current age economics business means just that the people who have money today that could restore the buildings, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, that happens an awful lot. It came up with issues around the around buildings here, the old nuclear reactor at the UW, the shell box. I mean,
right. The shell box,
look,
right.
Yeah, look, here's the thing. This is contextual as well as, if you go to Melbourne, you can see the shot tower inside a shopping mall. You see essentially an entire industrial complex that's been preserved with a dome over it. And, it may be that it's now trendy shops, but, oftentimes a developer is going to have the means to do what they say they cannot do. And it's a question under, the American legal system will often protect them if government is asking too much. But sometimes if they want to get a project built, there can be another form of blending that can happen with regard to, and it's difficult you're bringing me back to my lawyer days, but it's difficult in this state because of, sometimes the difficulties of mixing public and private money. But I'd say you've got to exhaust the most creative options. That's one answer to that question. And sometimes, unfortunately, it might take a legal process to do it.
Is that what this is? Is this a blending? You use the phrase.
Yeah, I mean, this is a blending. This is Cold Drop Yards at King's Cross in London. And I guess sometimes it's worth noting that in other places, people aren't necessarily fighting the concept that heritage, as it's called there, is important. And they've got to deal with it one way or another. And it's often a blend. And
so
it's often.
I'm looking at old cobblestones. I'm looking at, or new cobblestones.
Yeah.
And then to the right on this picture, I'm looking at old archways. And behind, and then right behind it is some brand new winged roof structure that was built over some older industrial site. Right.
And then you've got to the left, you've got what they call a gas holder, an old, from a big old gas tank, but that's an apartment building, or that's flats that are there now. This is a blend.
Is it good?
Yeah, I'm not an architect. Some people would say it's good. It's a nice development.
You've walked there though. I mean,
yeah, of course. It's a is it good? Well, it's gentrified. It's high end, but it's a wonderful semi-public place, isn't it? The architecture is, I would say, not displeasing. I think there's a bigger issue here. How contextual is it? Because you can see this same kind of deal in a redeveloped port facility in many cities in Europe. and so you could argue that the big architecture firms are taking a monocultural approach to these places and perhaps not honoring the local setting as much as you think they are. But to the original point, this is a blending that where it is, let's just say it's accepted that heritage needs to be worked with in some capacity. And it's not about that single building dispute we tend to see here. It's about age value of a place and preserving those facets that make sense to preserve. In the American context, American preservation is may use the term that's used often with contempt. This is a facadectomy.
Facadectomy.
But maybe is it better than nothing? And so I think you're aware, and many who are watching may be aware of the Pike Pine here and the conservation district, that through the work of many in the community, the businesses and others, they came up with something that tried to preserve facades and allow height bonuses for those buildings that do a pretty good job of it. And I talk about that in the book. Some people aren't going to like it, but it's a blend, it's a mixture. It may be the best we can do, and it may be in a democracy a way that accommodates all in one.
You have said, and go to your Apple building picture. You have said that one way of thinking about this, the learn model, and one thing about weighing what we see and understanding its context, is that in a sense, this is also a way to be better tourists. But it also seems to me it makes us better tourists in the best sense of the word in our own cities. Is it the same thing when you talk about being touristic?
Well, I think what I do in the book is I talk about tourism based on expectations. And I do think that the top two photos on the right, going clockwise from the top right, that's in Melbourne. Some people may recognize Federation Square in Melbourne, which had its own architectural debates as it gave Melbourne its first public space that it never had only about 20 years ago. And then right below it is in Stockholm, the People's Park, Kungsträdgården. Apple tried to put one of the sort of world-class town square projects in both of these places, and they were denied because, to your point, I think they assumed a sort of generic approach, creating the Apple Store as the town center was going to be embraced by everyone who lived or visited. And they weren't in the Stockholm case, they even bought the land. They weren't the better, to your point, I mean, I think that both of these denials, which had Indigenous issues in the Federation Square situation based on a building they wanted to take down, in Stockholm, it belied an entire misunderstanding about the long-term history of the site and the park around it. I think what you're driving at is if we understand the true history of these places better, rather than a sort of fantasy understanding, either going forward or looking back, you're going to create a better overall. It's kind of like me walking the canal in England. You're going to get the real story holistically, and looking forward and back. I may be not entirely answering your question, but that's where it took me.
Well, it's like, well, here, I'll ask it this way.
Okay.
the Cinque Terre that you talked about in a podcast I listened to, and you talk about in your writings too.
Yeah.
Or you could look at Venice.
Yeah.
Are those places able to withstand the how are those places able to withstand the onslaught of
Right.
people who come for the fantasy of what of
Yeah.
the
The
place?
Disneyland. Yeah.
Yeah, the
Well,
Disneyland.
the answer is in Venice's case, they're not. And there's the great hope that the pandemic was going to change all that. And guess what? Are you aware of the surprise appearance of cruise ships again in Venice proper, which wasn't supposed to happen?
I was depressed by it.
Yeah. So, I'd say the Cinque Terre question I can answer more directly, and that is they limit admissions. They've created a permit system to let people in, during the high seasons. And, we need to think about these World Heritage sites like the Cinque Terre a little more critically sometimes, and they're still going to be popular places, but unfortunately, it's a market intervention approach sometimes that requires a permit or it's like the San Juan ferries here in the summer. At some point, you had to get reservations, and so these are policy and regulatory solutions that need to happen. And in many cases now, it's also behaviors that are relevant to the climate change issue as well, in terms of,
but in a sense, it's also about what our fantasy is about a place versus what its value is in the real world to the real people. And you've talked,
absolutely.
and
Yeah,
you've
absolutely.
talked about like going that Mr. India place. That's a place to go as a tourist for you because you understand its context. And we need to see all cities in the same way, I guess. I mean,
well, no,
some places aren't so beautiful that I want to go visit them, but I guess I can understand their context.
Yeah, I mean, look, I mean, one thing that I was talking about, I talked about it in a lot of the interviews I've had about the book and with my friends. Before the pandemic, I just talked about it today with Peggy and Alan here on Queen Anne Hill, who I'm staying with. And that is, at the beginning of the book, I bring the reader on a little bit of an exercise, that isn't as esoteric as learn. And I wrote it before the pandemic, and I'm being tongue in cheek here, I'm very proud of how prescient I was, because I say, imagine if the world around you disappeared and the places that you're so accustomed to and the routes you're so used to traveling just went away. How would you reinvent your place, your city? Would you, and this is where I'm speaking to your point, if you're in Dublin, would you reinvent the Dublin of James Joyce? If in Athens, would you reinvent classical Greece? In London, London of Charles Dickens, and so on and so forth. Oftentimes, we see places through the lens of what we want to see. And I think the pandemic has brought us to this point that we've really had to immerse in many cases with our near, our near term destinations. That's why the 15-minute city suddenly has, which is was a political tool of Mayor Hidalgo in Paris, but it's been embraced everywhere now. And it's not a new idea, by the way, because, hey, people have been living, within 15 minutes. And so they're thinking, how can we do this going forward?
What is the 15-minute city?
Oh, the idea that everything you need should be within a 15-minute walk or bike ride, right? And so we need to create more sustainable and climate sensitive places by doing that just about everywhere and everywhere we can. But to your point, place oftentimes, and I've played around with this with the way I've presented where we live right now. You can go and find, this wondrous not colonial, but traditional English setting, Tudor, whatever. and people love it. I measure these things by Facebook likes sometimes because it's what they want. It's the idea. It's the media idea of something they've grown up with, the magical media idea. And I have a lot in the book about the Tower of London, breaking it down. But the Tower of London is also could be a functional cell phone, cellular tower as well. There's just so many different ways of looking at places, and we have to be careful that we're not charmed by a sort of touristic sense of wonder, unless that's readily what every place is not Disneyland. It's going to happen.
Are you suggesting that if the cell companies said we want to put a cell tower at the top of the Tower of London, and everybody around it said let's do it, that would be okay?
No, I'm not. But I'm saying that there's many uses for a structure.
But just not that one?
Not that one.
Hey, if you folks have questions before, we got about 10 minutes left. So if you got questions, shoot them to us, because I'm curious to know how you are thinking about the places around you. I mean, we've all been hunkered down enough that, I mean, that is what, I know that's what I've done. I think most of us have done that 15-minute city sort of thing. I mean, we have walked around our neighborhoods and said, I never noticed that house. Oh, look at that beautiful courtyard they built. Look at those wonderful stairways that are there. So the city does become a much more interesting place when we look at it.
Steve, if I could, this is a tour of the 6 case studies in the book, and we need not, no pun intended, dwell on them at length, but I do want to just very briefly mention the one on the upper left, and that's Kiruna in Lapland in northern Sweden. This is another ideal in a sense, because a mining company's legally obliged to move the center of town because there's subsidence underneath based on a 100-year-old mine. And they're essentially relocating a good part of the town from one place to another. And the town has been there for 150 years. And the exercise of consulting with the locals in terms of what the new town should be was absolutely fascinating. And to cut a long story short, it took years of immersion, and the result is really interesting. In some cases, they're moving the church, okay, but then all of the questions that we're sort of implying in this discussion came up. All right, if we're moving the church and we're going to replicate the engineering of the church as best we can on a hill with a view like this, what about that grove of trees over there that's so important to the setting? What about the cemetery? And then there's questions like, well, what about the bench where I met my wife 40 years ago? But the result is not a literal transplantation of the town. The result is a mixed bag. It's a blend. And so this is the new town hall and house of culture, meaning community center. And the spatial relationships inside these buildings are very reminiscent of what was in the old towns, but the architecture is different. But they are faced with built materials that are suggestive of the former town. They're moving their memories as well as the literal structures. And they're also trying to create a place that is contemporary with modern issues of the day. And I would say that is one of the most fascinating parts of this exercise, that I got to go, basically stay there for 3 days and walk around and understand what they're trying to do. And when you get that opportunity to see something like that, it becomes very instructive about how we might take that admittedly ideal and difficult to replicate exercise back to where we live.
What did they do with the graves?
I think they're moving them. I think they're moving the cemetery.
And did they bring somebody's bench or some memory of that bench into a place?
No, they're bringing the bench. They're bringing the bench. But I think it's really the city hall is amazing because it became a very familiar place. Townspeople would walk in. It was the first new building to open. and townspeople would walk in, and the architects did a wonderful job replicating the relationships of the stairway and other key elements, but it was different. In that case, it was not entirely, I mean, they took some things but it was a hybrid, it was a blend of the sorts we're talking about.
Take 5 minutes and tell us why these bottom 3 pictures help us be better citizens of cities.
Okay, the one starting on the lower left, that's Macroom, an old market town near Cork in Ireland, and I stumbled into an amazingly talented group of young architects who, at the Architecture Biennale in Venice in 2018, and their project, which was the Irish Pavilion at that Biennale, there's now a new Architecture Biennale in Venice. Their project was about 6 or 7 Irish market towns and how to re-expose their DNA, if you will. And it was much of the same thing we've been talking about so far tonight, but the grace with which they stated the principles and the ways in which they developed ideals for consultation with the locals are quite magical. And again, I had the privilege of going to Macroom and hanging out with them for a few days when they did a tour of the pavilion after the fact. And it was amazing to watch them. And the reason was that they were in the business of this deep listening and learning and ideals of the sort we've discussed tonight. And I saw it turned into the same old listening session with people's gripes about this or that, but it was somehow different in the way that the locals were empowered to speak. The one in the middle is the high-end Bloomberg European headquarters in London. High-end project. Bloomberg, to his credit, knew, even though this is another Foster and Partners building, it's a very high-end capitalistic endeavor. Bloomberg, based on his New York mayor experience, knew what he was doing in terms of honoring a public in a strange city. And what you see is a building that actually was built at a much lower height level than had been approved with a prior building that never made it out of the recession. And it reopened this pathway between the buildings that you see in front of you. That is the oldest street in London. It's an old Roman road. And guess what? Kind of like Amazon here, these are storefronts along this road for the employees to come out and patronize. No chains. They are all local businesses subsidized by Bloomberg. One other really cool thing is they integrated with the tube system, the transport system, and they relocated an amazing Roman temple that had been removed. They relocated it to its historic site along a buried river and turned it into an archaeological museum run by the Museum of London. So they gave back, even though you could argue about a debatable architecture. It's also a very sustainable building, which people love to talk about this building. But they gave back so much, and as Michael Jones, the senior partner of Foster, who worked with Bloomberg on this, and when I talked to him, he said we did what we should do with this building because we had the ability to do so. So I found it. It's the high-end example in the book, and it's been much written about by others, but I looked at it from a context perspective, and it's like Karuna, it's an amazing example. Finally, at lower right, this is right next to Waterloo Station in London, and it's about along the Lower Marsh, which was once one of the longest market streets in London. It's about the We Are Waterloo Business Improvement District and all of the things they are doing to incubate local business, small local businesses, and re-enable more market stalls at reduced entry fees. And I kudos to their chief executive, Natalie Rabin, who was of immense help to me in understanding this place and introduced me to a lot of key people. But it's a sort of a local approach driven by, as I said, a business improvement district, and a lot of on the ground practical examples. And these are all in chapter 6 of the book.
Is there a social media site where people can share their photos and discuss and interact based on the concepts, the learned concepts and the other concepts you talk about?
I haven't done that yet. I should. You want to do it for? Yeah,
No.
we can do it.
No, just do hashtag learn on Instagram, and maybe folks will join that way.
Yeah, I mean, no, that's a good idea. I've done some of that, and I have a blog site, sustainingplace.com, where I've put out my own micro examples, and I've strolled around. I did a series of 18 short videos on concepts of the book. But just like my last book, when people ask me, well, the urban diary, is there a place where people can share their urban diaries? I never really did that, because I found that when we did, people didn't necessarily march forth and do it. And those types of efforts take a lot of curating. And I guess my rationale is they're best left to whatever top-down, bottom-up co-creating process is going on in a particular locality.
All right, so we'll do it ourselves. We'll do it ourselves. Chuck, I like the book. It's really great to see you continue to think about these things and to give us tools to think about our surroundings. I appreciate you doing this tonight.
Well, thanks, Steve. It was I really appreciate your agreement to help out here. You and I have talked about this stuff for years, and I think it's a great excuse to come back to Seattle and see my mom and all sorts of things like that none of us have been able to do for the last year and a half. So it's been quite meaningful to have this opportunity. I'd like to thank you and Town Hall for letting me back in.
Yeah, we'll let you in as long as you got your vaccine. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Thanks, Town Hall. Thanks, you guys. Thanks for listening, and thanks for asking questions. Thanks a lot.
Yeah. Thank you both so much. Thanks for being here, and thanks for your presentation. I really appreciated the photos. Thanks for bringing those, Professor Wolfe. That's great. I want to encourage people, if you're interested in purchasing the book, to click on the link in the chat below. That'll take you right to the publisher tonight. And there is a promo code. I hope that works for you. I think I heard that from somebody that it maybe wasn't working. We'll look into that, but keep that in mind as you're checking it out. Hopefully we'll be able to see you two in person sometime soon. But thanks again for doing this virtual event, and hope you have a great night.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you very much again.
Thank you.